I am your host, Mr. Hercule.
Now, shall we begin our little investigation?
The English winter, as my friend Hercule Poirot often remarked, was a personal affront to his constitution. We sat together in the first-class carriage of a train rattling through the snow-draped countryside of Kent, the wind howling against the windows like a banshee. Poirot was muffled in so many layers of wool and fur that he resembled a very expensive, very fastidious bear. Only his sharp, bird-like eyes and the tips of his magnificently waxed moustache remained visible. "Mon ami," he sighed, the sound muffled by his scarf. "Why is it that the English insist on celebrating the New Year in the most inhospitable of climates? In Belgium we understand the value of a stove that actually produces heat. Here you have the open fire which roasts the face while the back remains a block of ice. It is not logical, Hastings, it is not civilized." "Come now, Poirot," I said, trying to maintain a cheerful tone despite the draught. "Sir Alister Vane is an old friend, and his New Year's Eve parties are legendary. Besides, you need the rest. The case of the missing cameo quite wore you out." Poirot straightened a stray thread on his cuff with a look of immense suffering. "Rest? To rest the body is to rust the brain. However, the air of the country, though perilously cold, may perhaps clarify the thoughts." And Sir Alister's invitation was particular. He reached into his pocket and produced a thick, cream-coloured card. It was embossed with the Vane family crest. Sir Alister was a titan of the shipping industry, a man who had built an empire on the waves but preferred to spend his retirement in the isolation of the Kentish hills. The invitation invited us for a 3-day stay at Blackwood Manor to ring in the year 1936. But it was the handwritten note at the bottom that had piqued Poirot's interest. "Do come, Poirot. I find myself surrounded by ghosts, and I suspect one of them intends to become quite solid before the clock strikes 12. "A theatrical way of putting it," I remarked. "Sir Alister was never a man of simple words," Poirot replied, his eyes narrowing. "He is a man of secrets. And when a man of secrets speaks of ghosts, Hastings, he is usually speaking of the past. The past has a way of catching up, especially when the year is about to turn. We arrived at the station as the afternoon light was dying into a bruised purple. A sleek Daimler awaited us, driven by a chauffeur whose face was as grim as the weather. The drive to Blackwood Manor was a silent affair, the tires crunching over fresh snow as we ascended a winding private road lined with skeletal oaks. The manor itself was a sprawling Tudor edifice, its dark timbering and white plasterwork looking like a monochrome photograph against the darkening sky. Yellow light spilled from the leaded windows, promising a warmth that Poirot greeted with a grunt of approval. As we were ushered into the great hall, the atmosphere of the house hit me instantly. It was not the festive cheer one expected on December 30th. There was a heaviness in the air, a sense of suppressed breath. The hall was decorated with holly and ivy, and a massive pine tree stood in the corner, but the scent of evergreen was masked by the faint cloying smell of old floor wax and something else, something metallic and sharp. Sir Alister Vane met us at the foot of the great staircase. He was a tall, craggy man in his late 60s, with a mane of white hair and eyes that seemed to be looking at something a mile behind you. He shook my hand briefly and then turned to Poirot with a look of profound relief. "You came," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Good. The house is full, Poirot. Family, associates, the usual vultures." "You sounded troubled in your letter, monsieur," Poirot said, his eyes already darting around the hall, taking in the portraits on the walls and the two figures watching us from the gallery above. "Troubled?" Sir Alister gave a short, harsh laugh. "I am surrounded by people who are waiting for me to die, and one who might be tired of waiting. But tonight we shall be merry. Tomorrow is the eve, and I have a tradition to uphold. A grand dinner, a toast at midnight, and then, well, then the new year begins." He leaned in closer to Poirot, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Watch them, Poirot. Watch them all. They think I'm an old fool, but I've seen the way they look at the safe in my study. I've heard the whispers in the library. There is a poison in this house." Before Poirot could respond, a woman descended the stairs. She was strikingly beautiful in a cold, angular way, dressed in a gown of shimmering silver silk. This was Eleanor, Sir Alister's much younger wife, "Alistair, darling, don't bore Monsieur Poirot with your melodramatics," she said, her voice like velvet. "He has only just arrived. Come, the others are in the drawing room. We were just discussing the seating arrangements for tomorrow." She led us into the drawing room where the vultures were gathered. There was Marcus Vane, Sir Alister's nephew and heir apparent, a man with a weak chin and a restless habit of jingling the change in his pockets. Sitting near him was Julian Thayer, Sir Alister's private secretary, a pale, precise young man who seemed to disappear into the furniture. In a corner, sipping a glass of sherry, was Dr. Arbuthnot, a long-time friend of the family with a weary face and steady hands. Finally, there was Miss Cynthia Vane, Sir Alister's niece, a young woman with nervous eyes who clutched a silk handkerchief as if it were a lifeline. The introductions were polite, but the tension was palpable. Every time Sir Alister spoke, the room went slightly too quiet. Every time someone laughed, it sounded forced. Poirot stood by the fireplace, warming his hands. He looked like a man perfectly at ease, but I knew better. He was observing the tilt of a head, the flicker of an eyelid, the way Marcus Vane avoided his uncle's gaze. "A charming assembly," Poirot remarked to me later as we dressed for dinner in our respective rooms. "Such a variety of interests." "Do you really think Sir Alister is in danger, Poirot?" I asked, struggling with my stiff collar. Poirot turned from the mirror, having achieved a bow tie of mathematical perfection. "In this house, Hastings, the danger is like the snow outside. It piles up quietly, flake by flake, until the weight is enough to cause an avalanche. Sir Alister is a man who has made many enemies in his quest for gold, and now he has brought them all under one roof for the turn of the year." He walked to the window and looked out at the white expanse. "The year 1935 is dying, Hastings, and I fear it will not be the only thing that ceases to breathe before the sun rises on the 1st of January. As the dinner gong sounded, echoing through the cold stone corridors of Blackwood Manor, I felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. The stage was set, the players were in their places, and the first act of a deadly drama was about to begin. The dining room of Blackwood Manor was a cavern of mahogany and silver, illuminated by the flickering tongues of a dozen tall beeswax candles. To anyone else it might have seemed the height of festive opulence, but to Poirot it was a study in profound disorder. He sat between Eleanor Vane and Cynthia, his eyes frequently darting to the centre of the table where a silver epergne stood slightly askew. I could see the twitch in his fingers. The poor fellow was suffering more from the lack of symmetry than from the chilling draughts that snuck through the heavy velvet curtains. Sir Alister sat at the head of the table, presiding over the meal like a king in a besieged fortress. He was in a strange mercurial mood, alternating between booming laughter and a sharp, biting sarcasm directed at his guests. "Eat up, Marcus," Sir Alister barked, pointing a trembling finger at his nephew. "It's expensive pheasant, probably the last decent meal you'll have. Before the creditors finally catch up with you, I hear the bailiffs are particularly active in London this winter." Marcus Vane's face flushed a deep, ugly red. He gripped his fork so tightly his knuckles turned white. "I'm managing, uncle. There's no need to make a scene in front of Monsieur Poirot." "Oh, Poirot isn't fooled by your managing, are you, monsieur?" Sir Alister chuckled, though there was no mirth in it. "He sees through the paint and the polish. He knows when a ship is sinking long before the water hits the deck." Poirot dabbed his mouth with his napkin, his expression unreadable. "I see many things, Sir Alister, but mostly I see that your wine is excellent, though perhaps served 2 degrees too cold for the bouquet to truly bloom." The tension shifted, but did not dissipate. Eleanor Vane sat with a frozen elegance, her eyes never leaving her husband, while Julian Thayer, the secretary, ate with a mechanical precision that I found oddly unsettling. He spoke only when spoken to, his voice a soft, dry rustle of paper. Dr. Arbuthnot, meanwhile, watched Sir Alister with professional concern. "You should slow down on the port, Alister," the doctor cautioned quietly. "Your heart isn't what it was 10 years ago." "My heart is made of iron, Arbuthnot. It's the people around me who are soft," Sir Alister retorted. He looked around the table, his gaze lingering on each person with a predatory intensity. "Tonight, I have a special announcement, a New Year's gift, you might call it. After the toast at midnight, I shall be making a change to certain legal arrangements, a clarification of my legacy. A heavy silence followed. The word will was not spoken, but it hung in the air like a guillotine blade. Cynthia Vane let out a small, choked sound and dropped her silk handkerchief. Julian Thayer's hand paused over his water glass. Eleanor simply lowered her eyelids, her face a mask of marble. The hours between dinner and midnight were the longest I have ever experienced. We migrated to the library, a vast room lined with leather-bound volumes that seemed to swallow the light. Poirot remained uncharacteristically quiet, standing by a globe of the world, slowly spinning it with one finger while his ears remained attuned to every whisper in the room. At 11:50 p.m., the atmosphere reached a fever pitch. Sir Alister insisted we all gather in the great hall. The servants had been dismissed for their own celebrations in the wing, leaving only our small, tense circle. On a large silver tray, a bottle of vintage champagne sat ready, surrounded by 8 delicate crystal flutes. "The time approaches," Sir Alister announced, his voice echoing in the rafters. He began to pour the wine. His hands were shaking now, the liquid splashing slightly onto the silver tray. "Allow me, monsieur," Poirot offered, stepping forward with his usual politeness. No, I'll do it myself," Sir Alister snapped. "The host must pour the draught of the new year. It is tradition." He handed out the glasses one by one. I noticed he took the last glass for himself, a tall, ornate flute that differed slightly from the others. He stood before the grand-grandfather clock that dominated the hall. The pendulum swung with a heavy, rhythmic thud, counting down the final seconds of 1935. "To the future," Sir Alister said, raising his glass. "And to the settling of all accounts." The clock began to strike. The deep, resonant chimes filled the room, vibrating in my very bones. 1, 2, 3. At the 6th stroke, the lights flickered and suddenly died, plunging the hall into a darkness so absolute it felt physical. I heard a sharp intake of breath, the sound of glass shattering on stone, and then a strange, wet thud. "Alister!" Eleanor's voice called out, sharp with sudden panic. "Don't move, anyone!" Poirot's voice rang out, authoritative and calm. "Hastings, your torch!" I fumbled in my pocket for the small electric torch I always carried when traveling. My fingers were clumsy with nerves, but finally I clicked it on. The beam sliced through the darkness, dancing across the terrified faces of the guests before settling on the floor at the base of the clock. Sir Alister Vane lay crumpled on the Persian rug. His glass had shattered, the champagne soaking into the wool like a dark stain. His eyes were wide, staring up at the rafters with an expression of profound shock. Dr. Arbuthnot rushed forward, kneeling beside the fallen man, and pressing 2 fingers to his neck. The silence that followed was broken only by the clock finishing its 12 strokes. The new year had arrived, but for Sir Alister, time had stopped forever. Arbuthnot looked up, his face pale in the torchlight. "He's dead. He appears to have collapsed. His heart, I expect." "No," Poirot said softly, stepping into the circle of light. He did not look at the body, but at the tray on the table. "Look at the lips, doctor, the blue tint, the smell of bitter almonds beneath the scent of the wine." Poirot looked at the gathered guests, his eyes like 2 points of green fire. It was not the heart that failed Sir Alister, it was the loyalty of his circle. He has been murdered. The lights flickered back to life with a cruel suddenness, revealing a tableau of frozen horror. Julian Thayer stood by the switchboard in the corner, his hand still resting on the brass lever. The brilliance of the chandeliers seemed to mock the stillness of the man on the floor. "Murdered!" Eleanor Vane's voice was a whisper, yet it cut through the room like a blade. She had not moved toward her husband's body. She stood by the fireplace, her silver gown catching the light. "Monsieur Poirot, that is a monstrous thing to suggest. Dr. Arbuthnot said it was his heart." "The heart? It has stopped, yes," Poirot said, his voice deceptively gentle. He was crouched by the body, not touching anything, but his head was tilted like a curious robin. "But the heart does not. Usually turn the lips to the color of a bruised plum, nor does it perfume the air with the scent of the amande amère, the bitter almond." Dr. Arbuthnot, still on his knees, leaned closer and sniffed, his face drained of what little color it had left. My God, prussic acid. "Cyanide! Cyanide!" Marcus Vane cried out, his voice cracking. He backed away, his hands flying to his pockets, the familiar jingle of coins sounding frantic. But that's impossible. He poured the wine himself. We all saw him. He took the last glass. Precisely, Poirot murmured. He stood up, dusted his knees with a silk handkerchief, and looked around the room. His gaze was not one of accusation yet, but of intense, systematic cataloguing. A man who pours his own death is either a man who seeks to end his own life, or a man who has been deceived by a hand more clever than his own. And Sir Alister, I think, was not a man to leave his empire by choice, not when he had clarifications to make regarding his legacy. Cynthia Vane gave a low moan and sank into a velvet chair, her face buried in her hands. "This is a nightmare. This can't be happening." "It is happening, mademoiselle," Poirot said. "And because of the storm outside, it is happening in a world of our own. Hastings, if you would be so good as to check the telephone." I hurried to the mahogany desk in the corner. I lifted the receiver, but the silence that met me was absolute. "Dead, Poirot. The wires must have come down in the snow." "As I suspected," Poirot said. He looked at the heavy oak doors of the hall. "The roads are blocked, the wires are severed. We are, as you say in England, in a spot. But for the murderer, it is a spot of great discomfort, for they are here in this room and they cannot leave." The silence that followed was heavy with suspicion. Each guest began to look at the other, the bonds of family and friendship fraying in the harsh light of the chandeliers. "We must call the police," Julian Thayer said, his voice regaining its dry, clipped tone. "Even if the phones are down, someone must go to the village. Through 6 feet of snow and a gale that would freeze the marrow." Arbuthnot shook his head. "It would be suicide." "Then we must wait," Poirot declared. He stepped into the center of the hall, reclaiming the authority that the chaos had briefly stolen. "But we shall not wait in idleness. The little grey cells do not sleep while the body grows cold. Monsieur Thayer, as the secretary, I must ask you to lock this hall. No one enters, no one leaves. The body must remain as it is until the light of day. Doctor, you will assist me in a preliminary examination of the glasses." "I won't have it," Marcus shouted. "You're not a policeman, Poirot. You're just a foreigner who was invited for dinner." Poirot drew himself up to his full, albeit modest, height. His chest swelled. "I am Hercule Poirot, Monsieur Vane. To the police, I am a colleague. To the criminal, I am a catastrophe. If you are innocent, you have nothing to fear from my foreign eyes. But if you are not—" He left the sentence hanging, a chilling promise of what was to come. Eleanor Vane stepped forward, her eyes cold. "Do what you must, Monsieur Poirot. If my husband was truly poisoned, I want the person responsible found. But do not think that your reputation gives you the right to harass us." "Harassment is the tool of the clumsy, madame," Poirot replied with a slight bow. "I prefer the truth. Now, if you please, everyone will move to the small drawing room. Do not touch the tray, do not touch the glasses, and most importantly, do not touch each other." As the group began to file out, their shadows stretched long and distorted across the floor. Poirot remained for a moment, staring at the shattered crystal on the rug. He reached down and picked up a tiny fragment of glass with a pair of silver tweezers he had produced from his pocket. "A tragedy of the new year, Hastings," he whispered. "He was a difficult man, Poirot," I said, looking at Sir Alister's body. "But he didn't deserve this. No one deserves the bitter almond, Hastings. It is a coward's weapon. It strikes from the dark, from the safety of a smile. But the dark is where I work best. Come, we have much to discuss with our vultures." The small morning room was a stark contrast to the grim scene in the great hall. A fire crackled in the hearth, but it did little to thaw the icy silence that had settled over the inhabitants of Blackwood Manor. Poirot had commandeered a high-backed velvet chair, positioned so that he could observe the face of anyone who entered, while I sat at a small escritoire to record the proceedings. "Method and order, Hastings," Poirot murmured, adjusting the placement of a pen on the desk until it was perfectly parallel to the edge. "Without them, the mind is a chaotic forest. We must plant our trees in straight rows if we are to see the path." The first to be summoned was Eleanor Vane. She entered with a regal composure that was almost unnerving. She had changed into a black silk robe, but her face remained as pale and sharp as a diamond. "You find this all very intriguing, do you not, Monsieur Poirot?" she asked, her voice devoid of emotion as she took the seat opposite him. "A tragedy turned into a puzzle for your amusement." "Amusement is not the word I would use, madame," Poirot replied gravely. "Justice is a sombre mistress. Tell me of your husband's health." Dr. Arbuthnot mentioned a heart condition. Eleanor gave a faint, bitter smile. Alistair had the heart of a titan when it came to business, but yes, physically it was failing. He took digitalis. But he was not a man to die quietly in his sleep. He wanted a grand finale, and the clarification of his legacy he mentioned at dinner. Poirot leaned forward, his eyes bright. Were you aware of his intentions? Alistair threatened to change his will every time the wind changed direction, she said smoothly. He enjoyed the power it gave him over Marcus and Cynthia. He liked to see them crawl. As for me, I am well provided for by our marriage settlement. I had no reason to wish him dead a moment sooner than nature intended. Yet nature was assisted by a chemist, Poirot noted. When the lights extinguished, Madame, what did you hear? I heard the wind, I heard the clock, and I heard Alistair gasp. It was a wet, choking sound. I reached out for him, but in the dark I lost my bearings. She left shortly after, her silver screen poise never wavering. Poirot watched her go, then signalled for Marcus Vane. The nephew was the polar opposite of the widow. He paced the small room like a caged animal, his hands trembling as he lit a cigarette. It's a setup, Marcus burst out before Poirot could speak. He was going to cut me out. Everyone knew it. He called me a vulture at the table. If I'm the one with the motive, then I'm the one you'll blame, right? That's how you fellows work. I work with facts, Monsieur Vane, Poirot said coolly. Is it a fact that you are in significant debt to the London bookmakers? Marcus choked on a lungful of smoke. How did you? The little grey cells do not require a private investigator to see the wear on your cuffs and the desperation in your eyes. You needed Sir Alistair to die before he signed that new will, did you not? I didn't kill him, Marcus shouted, slamming a fist onto the table. When the lights went out, I was by the sideboard. I didn't move. I heard someone move, though, a soft shuffling sound near the tray. And then the glass broke. A shuffling sound, Poirot repeated, making a note in the air with his finger. Not a step, but a shuffle. Interesting. Next came Cynthia Vane, who was still weeping silently into her handkerchief. She could tell us little, except that she had felt a cold draught just as the lights failed, as if a door had been opened nearby. Julian Thayer, the secretary, followed her. He was as precise as ever, his answers delivered with the efficiency of a ledger. I was at the light switch, Monsieur Poirot, Thayer explained. Sir Alistair had complained earlier in the evening about a flicker in the library. I went to check the fuses when the hall went dark. It was a genuine fault, I assure you. The wiring in this house is Victorian. And your own prospects, Monsieur Thayer. Sir Alistair was a demanding employer. He was a tyrant, Thayer said, his voice momentarily losing its blandness. But a tyrant who paid well. My future was secure as long as he lived. Now, I am merely a secretary with a dead master. When the room was finally empty, Poirot turned to me. What do you make of it, Hastings? A room full of people with reasons to weep, yet only the niece sheds a tear. A wife who is a stone, a nephew who is a rabbit, and a secretary who is a machine. It seems Marcus had the most to gain by a sudden death, I said. If the will wasn't changed tonight, he's still the heir. The obvious is often the enemy of the true, Poirot mused. He walked to the window, looking out at the blizzard. They all spoke of what they heard and felt in the dark, but none of them mentioned the most important thing of all. And what was that? I asked. The Order of the Glasses, Hastings. The Order of the Glasses. The morning of January 1st arrived not with a celebratory sun, but with a flat grey light that seemed to drain the colour from the world. The snow had ceased falling, but it lay in great, suffocating drifts against the windows of Blackwood Manor, sealing us within a tomb of white. I found Poirot in the breakfast room, staring with profound disapproval at 2 boiled eggs. Is something wrong, Poirot? I asked, pouring myself a much-needed cup of black coffee. They are not of the same size, Hastings, he lamented, gesturing at the eggs with a silver spoon. How can the English hen be so anarchic? It is a lack of discipline that offends the soul. However, he sighed, we have larger irregularities to contend with than the produce of the poultry yard. You mean the murder, I said, dropping my voice. Have you reached a conclusion? I have reached several, but they are like the threads of a tapestry that have been tangled by a mischievous kitten. One must pull gently, mon ami, or the whole design is lost. He looked up as Dr. Arbuthnot entered, followed by Julian Thayer. Both men looked as though they hadn't slept a wink. The police won't be here for hours, perhaps a day, Arbuthnot announced, his voice weary. The village constable managed to get through on a radio set. The roads are completely impassable. He's told us to keep everyone together and touch nothing. A wise instruction, Poirot said, finally decapitating one of his eggs. But since I am already here, and since the grey cells do not appreciate the holiday, I have already taken the liberty of examining the great hall once more. Thayer blinked. And did you find anything, Monsieur Poirot, besides the obvious? The obvious is a very dangerous thing, Monsieur Thayer. It is a mask worn by the truth. For instance, it is obvious that Sir Alister was poisoned by the champagne he poured himself. But consider the tray. There were 8 glasses, 7 were identical. The 8th, the one Sir Alister chose, was an heirloom, a heavy Victorian flute with a deep red stem. Why did he choose that one? It was his favourite, Thayer replied simply. He used it every year. Precisely, it was a habit. And a habit is a gift to a murderer. It allows them to predict the future. Poirot rose from the table, his breakfast forgotten. Now, gentlemen, I believe it is time for a little exploration. In a house where the doors are locked by the snow, the truth must be hidden in the small places. Against the protests of Marcus Vane, who joined us in the hall looking haggard and smelling of stale tobacco, Poirot insisted on a search of the guests' quarters. It was a grim business. We moved from room to room. Eleanor's suite, smelling of expensive lilies, Cynthia's room, cluttered with damp handkerchiefs, and finally the Spartan quarters of Marcus Vane. It was here that the obvious reared its head with a vengeance. Poirot was examining a pair of Marcus's evening shoes, discarded carelessly near the wardrobe. He reached inside the right shoe and pulled out a small blue glass bottle. He uncorked it delicately and wafted the air toward his nose. "Bitter almonds," Arbuthnot whispered, standing in the doorway. "Cyanide." The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus Vane turned a shade of grey that matched the sky outside. He staggered back, his hands fluttering like trapped birds. I've never seen that before," he stammered. "It's a plant. Someone put it there." "It is a very convenient plant, Monsieur Vanet," Poirot said, his voice cold and hard. "It matches the poison that killed your uncle. It is found in your room. And you, of all people, had the most to gain by his death before he could alter his will." "I didn't do it!" Marcus screamed, his voice cracking into a sob. "I'm a gambler, yes, I'm a fool, but I'm not a killer. Thayer, tell them. You know I couldn't do this." Julian Thayer looked away, his jaw tight. "I know you were desperate, Marcus. You told me yesterday that if the old man didn't cough up, you were finished." "That is enough," Poirot declared, holding up the blue bottle. "Doctor, if you would be so kind as to take charge of this evidence. Monsieur Vanet, I must ask you to remain in your room, for your own safety as much as ours." As we left the room, locking the door behind us, Arbuthnot turned to Poirot. "Well, that's that then. A tragic business, but at least it's over. The boy was always a bad egg." "Over?" Poirot looked at the doctor, his eyebrows rising until they nearly touched his hairline. "You think it is over because we found a bottle in a shoe? Sacré bleu, doctor, you have a very high opinion of the criminal." "Mine's stupidity. What do you mean?" I asked, confused. "The evidence is right there. The evidence is too right there, Hastings. It is shouting at us. It is performing a dance and waving a flag. Does a man who has committed a brilliant murder in the dark, using the precise timing of a fuse and a clock, then leave the poison in his own shoe for the first person to find?" He began to walk down the corridor, his pace brisk. "No, mon ami, we have found the first false lead. The shuffling sound Marcus mentioned last night. He was right to hear it, but it was not the sound of a murderer. It was the sound of a frame-up." Poirot stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down into the great hall where Sir Alister's body still lay under a white sheet. "The murderer is clever, Hastings. Very clever. They have given us a victim, a motive, and a culprit. They have handed us a completed puzzle, but there is one piece that does not fit the picture, and until I find where it belongs, I shall not rest." The library of Blackwood Manor was a room of heavy shadows and the scent of dust and old leather. Poirot had requested that tea be served there, despite the grim circumstances. He sat by a low table, meticulously arranging a set of silver teaspoons in a perfect equidistant row. Eleanor Vane, Julian Thayer, Dr. Arbuthnot, and a trembling Cynthia were present. Marcus remained confined upstairs, a silent spectre over the gathering. "You look like a man playing a game of solitaire, Monsieur Poirot," Eleanor said, her voice sharp with impatience. She had not touched her tea. "Is this truly the time for such trivialities? My husband is dead, and my nephew is a prisoner in his own room. Life, madame, is often a game of solitaire, Poirot replied, his eyes never leaving the spoons. One moves the cards, one hopes for the sequence, but in murder it is a game of bridge. One must know the cards in the hand of the partner and the opponent. He looked up suddenly, his green eyes flashing. Let us discuss the dark. When the lights extinguished at the stroke of midnight, the world changed. In the light, we are who we pretend to be. In the dark, we are who we truly are. Monsieur Thayer, you were at the switch. Tell me, in that moment of blackness, what did you smell? Thayer blinked, his glasses catching the firelight. I smelled the ozone of the fuse, I suppose, and the candle smoke. And you, Mademoiselle Cynthia? I smelled the lilies, she whispered, the ones in the big vase by the clock. They felt overwhelming, like a funeral. And the smell of the amande des mers, Poirot asked softly. The cyanide. Did no one smell it before the glass broke? A silence stretched, thick and suffocating. Dr. Arbuthnot cleared his throat. Cyanide in that concentration has a potent odor, Poirot. But in a room full of heavy perfumes, champagne and floor wax, it's easily missed until the liquid is exposed to the air. Precisely, Poirot said. It is a scientific answer, but I am interested in the psychological answer. You see, a murderer who uses poison is a murderer who fears confrontation. They strike from a distance. They are the shufflers in the dark. He rose and began to pace the rug, his patent leather shoes clicking rhythmically. I have played a little game this morning. I have asked myself, if I were the killer, and I had placed the bottle in the shoe of the young Marcus, would I be feeling relieved, or would I be feeling anxious? He stopped behind Julian Thayer's chair. The secretary didn't flinch, but his neck muscles corded. I would be anxious, Poirot continued, because I would know that Hercule Poirot does not look where he is told to look. He looks where the shadows are deepest. For instance, the light switch. Monsieur Thayer, you told us the wiring was Victorian. A convenient excuse for a blackout. But I examined the fuse box this morning. The fuse did not blow because of age. It was assisted. A small piece of copper. Wire was used to create a short circuit at the precise moment the clock began to chime. It required method. It required a hand that knew the house. I am the secretary, Thayer said coldly. I know the house better than anyone. That doesn't make me a killer. No, Poirot agreed. It makes you an expert. But then we have the matter of the shuffling sound. Everyone heard it. But everyone describes it differently. Monsieur Marcus said it was a shuffle. Mademoiselle Cynthia said it was a draught. Madame Vance said she heard Alistair choke. Poirot turned to Eleanor. But you, madame, were standing closest to him. If someone had approached the tray to switch the glasses or drop the poison, you would have felt their movement, n'est-ce pas? I felt nothing, Eleanor said, her eyes like flint. It was pitch black. I told you I lost my bearings. And yet, Poirot mused, when the lights came on, you were standing exactly where you had been. Your bearings were remarkably well preserved. It is almost as if you didn't move at all, or as if you knew exactly what was happening in the dark. The psychological pressure in the room was now almost visible. Poirot wasn't accusing, he was dissecting. He was watching the way Arbuthnot's hand steadied his saucer, the way Cynthia's breathing hitched, the way Eleanor's gaze never wavered. The bottle in the shoe was a mistake, Poirot said, his voice dropping to a low melodic purr. It was too obvious, as I told Hastings. But the person who put it there did so because they are beginning to lose their nerve. They wanted the mystery to end quickly. But for me, it is only just beginning. He walked to the door and turned back, silhouetted against the dim light of the hallway. Tonight, we shall have another gathering. Not for a toast, but for a trial. I suggest you all reflect on the shuffling you heard, because the little grey cells have heard something quite different. They have heard the truth. As we left the library, Poirot leaned toward me. The rat is in the corner, Hastings. Now we must see which way it leaps. The afternoon of New Year's Day dragged on with a heavy, claustrophobic weight. The snow continued to bank up against the ground-floor windows, turning the interior of Blackwood Manor into a dim, amber-lit cavern. We were a house of ghosts, just as Sir Alister had predicted. The tension that had been a low hum at breakfast had escalated into a shrill, vibrating chord. I was in the library attempting to distract myself with a volume of Macaulay's history, when the silence was shattered by a piercing cry from the upper floor. It was Cynthia Vane. I reached the landing just as Poirot emerged from his room, his movements surprisingly light for a man of his build. We followed the sound of the sobbing to Sir Alister's private study. The door stood wide open. Inside, Cynthia was slumped against the doorframe, her hand pressed to her mouth. In the center of the room, the heavy mahogany desk had been ransacked. Papers were strewn across the Persian rug like fallen leaves, and the wall-mounted safe, hidden behind a portrait of a vain ancestor, swung open on its hinges. But it was the figure on the floor that arrested our attention. Julian Thayer lay sprawled near the desk. His glasses had fallen several feet away, and there was a dark, ugly bruise beginning to bloom across his temple. He was breathing, but he was deeply unconscious. "Mon Dieu," Poirot whispered, but he did not rush to the man. Instead, his eyes swept the room with the precision of a searchlight. "Hastings, the doctor, quickly!" By the time Dr. Arbuthnot arrived and began to tend to the secretary, the rest of the household had gathered in the doorway. Eleanor Vane stood perfectly still, her gaze fixed not on the unconscious Thayer, but on the gaping maw of the empty safe. "It's gone," she said, her voice a hollow rasp. "The new will. He told me he had placed it there yesterday afternoon. Is that all that is?" "Gone, madame?" Poirot asked, stepping over a pile of correspondence to stand by the safe. I don't know. Alister kept his private ledgers there. And the Varney diamonds." Dr. Arbuthnot looked up, his expression grim. "He's been struck with a heavy object, likely that brass paperweight on the floor. He's also been drugged. I can smell a faint trace of ether on his breath. He won't be waking up for some time. A second crime," I muttered, feeling the chill of the house settle into my bones. "The murderer is still active, Poirot. They're trying to cover their tracks. Or they are creating a new track for us to follow, Hastings," Poirot replied. He reached into the safe, his hand emerging with a small, charred scrap of paper that had been caught in the hinge. He examined it for a moment, his eyes narrowing, before slipping it into his pocket. He then turned his attention to the desk. Among the scattered papers was a small, leather-bound diary. Poirot picked it up with the tips of his fingers. "The ghosts," Poirot murmured, almost to himself. "Sir Alister spoke of ghosts, and here, in the pages of the past, they find their voice." He flipped through the book, his gaze jumping from line to line. Suddenly he froze. A low hiss of breath escaped his teeth. "What is it, Poirot?" I asked, stepping closer. "A revelation, Hastings. A revelation that changes the color of the entire sky." He looked at Eleanor, then at the trembling Cynthia, and finally at the closed door of Marcus's room down the hall. "We have been looking for a motive in the future, in the inheritance and the money, but the motive, it lies in the past. 30 years in the past." "30 years?" Eleanor echoed, her brow furrowing. "What are you talking about? Alister was in the East then, building the company." "And it was in the East that he met the first ghost," Poirot said. He closed the diary with a definitive snap. Monsieur Thayer was attacked because he saw something he was not meant to see, or perhaps because he was trying to take something he felt he was owed. But look at his hands, Doctor. Arbuthnot frowned and lifted Thayer's limp right hand. Under the fingernails was a faint white powdery residue. "Plaster?" the doctor suggested. "No," Poirot said, his voice dropping to a somber tone. "That is not plaster. That is the dust from the ceiling roses in the great hall, the same dust that would be disturbed if one were to climb a ladder to reach a certain fixture. The lights," I gasped. "The blackout." "Precisely," Poirot said. "The blackout was not a fault of the wiring, nor was it a simple short circuit at the fuse box. It was a masterpiece of timing, and Julian Thayer, the man who was at the switch, has been hiding the truth of that darkness. But he is not our murderer, Hastings. He is merely a man who tried to play a game with a predator and found himself outmatched." Poirot walked to the center of the room, his presence suddenly filling the space. The pieces, they begin to align. The shuffling in the dark, the scent of the lilies, the bottle in the shoe, and now the empty safe. There is a pattern here, as clear as the stars on a winter night, but it is a pattern of great cruelty. "Who did this, Poirot?" Marcus Vane's voice came from the doorway. He had been released from his room by the commotion, looking more broken than ever. "If Julian didn't do it, and I didn't do it—" "The truth is like the sun, Monsieur Van," Poirot said, turning to him. "It does not care if you are ready to see it. It rises regardless. And tonight at the stroke of 8, the sun will rise in this house. I have one final piece of the puzzle to find, a piece that is hidden in plain sight. Once I have it, the mask will fall. He looked at me, a strange flash of sadness in his eyes. Tell me, Hastings, do you remember the order of the glasses on the tray, the 7 identical ones and the one with the red stem? Yes, I said, puzzled. What of them? The red stem, Poirot whispered. It was not a choice of habit, Hastings. It was a choice of necessity, for in the dark, even a murderer must be able to feel the color of death. The great hall was a place of frozen silence. The heavy curtains remained drawn against the relentless white of the Kentish landscape, leaving the room in a state of perpetual twilight. Poirot stood before the silver tray, which remained exactly as it had been when the lights returned, save for the absence of the shattered red-stemmed glass and the body of Sir Alister. "You see it, Hastings?" Poirot asked, his voice a mere whisper that seemed to vibrate against the oak-panelled walls. "The order, the symmetry, or rather the lack of it." I looked at the 7 remaining crystal flutes. They stood in a ragged semicircle on the silver surface. To my eyes, they looked like any other group of glasses after a disrupted party. "I see 7 glasses, Poirot. One is missing. It was the red one, the one Sir Alister chose. Exactly, he chose it. But did he choose it because of habit, or because he was led to it like a horse to water?" Poirot pulled a magnifying glass from his pocket and began to examine the surface of the silver tray. He moved with a bird-like precision, his nose inches from the metal. "The shuffling sound, Hastings. You remember what the young Marcus said? A shuffling, not a step. I remember," I said. "He thought it was someone moving toward the tray. And the niece, she felt a draught," Poirot murmured. "And the wife, she stayed perfectly still. Now, look here." He pointed his glass at a series of faint circular scuffs on the silver tray, near the center where the épergnes stood. They were nearly invisible to the naked eye, but under the lens they were clear, 4 distinct marks where something heavy had been rotated. "The tray was turned," I gasped. "Precisely," Poirot said, his eyes glowing with a sudden sharp light. "It is a lazy Susan, is it not? The center portion of this table rotates to allow the passing of the condiments. The tray was placed upon it. In the dark, one does not need to walk to the glass. One only needs to reach out and turn the table. The shuffling was the sound of the mechanism, poorly oiled and protesting. But why turn it, I asked. If Sir Alister poured the wine himself, he would have known which glass he was taking. Unless, Poirot said, the glass he thought he was taking was not the glass he actually took. Consider the red stem. It is Victorian, heavy and highly textured. In the pitch black, it is the only glass one could identify by touch alone. But there is a second clue, Hastings, one that everyone overlooked because they were too busy looking at the death. He walked over to the towering grandfather clock. The pendulum continued its steady, indifferent beat. Tick, tock, tick, tock. Poirot knelt and reached underneath the heavy mahogany base. When he pulled his hand back, he was holding a tiny, crumpled piece of black felt, no larger than a postage stamp. "Felt?" I asked, leaning in. "From a hat?" "No, Hastings. This is the felt used on the base of heavy objects to prevent them from scratching the furniture. But look at the shape. It has been cut, and here, on the side, is a trace of something sticky." He sniffed it delicately. "Ah, beeswax. The same beeswax used to polish the floors of Blackwood Manor. I don't understand, Poirot. What does a piece of felt have to do with cyanide?" "Everything, mon ami. It is the how that leads us to the who. You see, the murderer did not just drop poison into a glass. That is too risky. The timing must be perfect, the blackout, the toast, the death. It was a choreographed dance, and for a dance, one needs markers on the floor." He stood up, his expression one of profound gravity. Sir Alister was a man of habit. He stood in the same spot every year to toast the clock. The murderer knew this. They prepared the stage during the afternoon when the house was resting. They placed a marker, this felt, on the floor to guide their own feet in the darkness, but they did something else, something much more clever. Poirot walked back to the tray and pointed to the bottle of champagne, now half empty and flat. "The bottle is innocent. I have tested a drop. It is pure. The poison was in the glass. But it was not in the liquid. It was a film, a coating of cyanide crystals mixed with a fast-acting solvent applied to the inside of the red-stemmed glass and allowed to dry. When the warm champagne was poured in, the poison dissolved instantly, "But Sir Alister chose the glass," I protested. "How could the murderer be sure?" "Because," Poirot said, his voice dropping to a chilling register, "the murderer gave him the glass. In the dark, during those 12 seconds of the clock's chime, the murderer did not move towards Sir Alister. They moved the world around him. They turned the table, they swapped the position of the flutes, and they guided his hand to the red stem, and they did it all while standing right next to him." He looked at the piece of black felt in his palm. "This was not a crime of opportunity, Hastings. It was a crime of mathematics. And there is one person in this house whose mind works in nothing but figures and precise intervals." "Thayer," I whispered. "The secretary?" "Monsieur Thayer has the mind," Poirot agreed. "But does he have the motive? Or is he, as I suspect, the victim of a much larger deception? The diary I found in the study, the ghosts of 30 years ago, they tell a story not of money but of a blood debt." Poirot tucked the felt into his waistcoat pocket. "I have the how, Hastings, and now, thanks to this little scrap of cloth, I have the where. There is one more place we must visit before the sun sets: the cellar. I believe we shall find that the Victorian wiring was not the only thing Julian Thayer was tinkering with." "What are you looking for now?" I asked. "The shadow of the third person, Hastings. The one who was in the room yet was not there. The one who provided the shuffling sound while another provided the draught." He turned toward the door, his eyes alight with the fire of discovery. "Come, the pieces are falling into place. The new year has brought us many things, but for one person in this house it has brought the end of a very long wait. The descent into the cellar of Blackwood Manor was, for Poirot, an ordeal of the highest magnitude. The stone steps were damp and uneven, coated in a fine patina of emerald moss that threatened the pristine shine of his patent leather boots. I followed him, holding a lantern aloft, its flickering orange glow casting elongated, dancing shadows against the rough-hewn walls. "Observe, Hastings," Poirot remarked, his voice echoing in the low-vaulted chamber, "the architecture of deception. Above us, the elegance of the Tudor hall. Below us, the machinery that makes the illusion possible. To find the truth, one must always be willing to go into the mud. I still don't see what the cellar has to do with a glass of poisoned champagne, Poirot," I admitted, my breath blooming in the frigid air. "Everything, mon ami. The blackout was the heart of this crime. It provided the curtain for the stage. Julian Thayer told us the wiring was old, and indeed it is, but a man who knows the order and the method does not rely on the whims of a Victorian fuse." We reached the main electrical board, a primitive arrangement of porcelain switches and exposed copper wires. Poirot did not look at the fuses first. Instead, he directed the light toward the ceiling, where a series of lead pipes and iron pulleys for the old dumbwaiter system disappeared into the shadows of the floorboards above. "The shuffling sound, Hastings. You thought it was feet. I thought it was a mechanism. Now look there." He pointed to a small, heavy iron weight, part of an old clockwork spit-turner once used in the kitchens. It had been rigged to a thin, incredibly strong length of piano wire. The wire snaked upward through a small hole bored recently into the floorboards, directly beneath the spot where the silver tray sat in the great hall. "A remote control," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "Precisely," Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. "The murderer did not need to be near the tray to turn it. They merely needed to release this weight. The wire wound around the base of the rotating table would spin the tray a predetermined distance. It was a masterpiece of mechanical timing." He moved to the fuse box and gestured for me to bring the lantern closer. There, wedged between the main lever and the casing, was a small, scorched piece of carbon. "And here is our blackout, a simple timed short circuit." It was not Julian Thayer who pulled the switch, Hastings. The switch pulled itself. Thayer was merely the witness provided by the killer to testify that the lights failed naturally. But Poirot, if Thayer didn't do it, then why was he attacked? "Because," Poirot sighed, "he was a man of precision. He noticed the same thing I did, the slight discrepancy in the timing of the fuse. He came down here to investigate, found this devilish engine, and was silenced before he could speak. The killer could not risk him explaining the how before they had finished the why." Poirot reached out and touched the piano wire. It hummed with a low, mournful note. This wire tells a story, Hastings, a story of a person who understands tension, who understands gears, and who possesses a heart as cold as the iron weight that hangs here. This is not the work of the desperate Marcus or the grieving Cynthia. Then who? Poirot turned to me, his face half hidden in the gloom. The ghosts I mentioned, Hastings. Do you remember the diary? In 1905, Sir Alister was a young engineer in the colonial service. He was involved in a bridge-building project in the Punjab. There. A disaster. A collapse. Many died. Alister was cleared of negligence, but the man who designed the structural supports, he was disgraced. He took his own life. A vendetta? I asked, a chill running down my spine. A debt of 30 years, Poirot replied. The designer had a daughter who grew up with nothing but the memory of her father's failure and the sight of Alister Vane's rising fortune. She learned the father's trade, Hastings. She learned the secrets of metal and wire. He began to climb the stairs, his movements purposeful. The red-stemmed glass was the finish line. The killer knew Sir Alister would reach for it in the dark because they had spent weeks conditioning him to do so. They were the one who always placed it in the same spot, who polished it, who made it the symbol of his status. And in the dark, with the turn of a hidden wire, they ensured it was the only thing his hand could find. As we stepped back into the warmth of the hallway, Poirot paused to adjust his tie in a mirror. The stage is set, Hastings. The culprit believes the vultures are fighting over the carcass. They believe they are safe behind their mask of mourning, but they have forgotten one thing. What's that? That Hercule Poirot, he said, tapping his temple, is also an engineer of the human soul, and I have found the flaw in their construction. He looked at the grand clock in the hall. It is nearly 8, the final gathering. I shall need you to be very observant, Hastings, for when I reveal the how, the killer will attempt one last mechanical trick, and this time it will be a matter of life and death. The great hall of Blackwood Manor was a theatre of shadows. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a heap of glowing embers, casting a fitful orange light upon the faces of those assembled. Poirot stood by the grandfather clock, his hands clasped behind his back, looking like a judge from a more ancient, more meticulous era. Julian Thayer, pale and with a heavy bandage around his head, sat in a propped-up chair, while the others, Eleanor, Marcus, Cynthia, and Dr. Arbuthnot, formed a tense semicircle. "Monsieur, mesdames," Poirot began, his voice surprisingly resonant in the high-ceilinged room. "The year 1936 has begun with a tragedy that was planned with the precision of a Swiss watch. We have a victim, a room from which no one could escape, and a method that seemed to defy the laws of the physical world. Sir Alister Vane poured his own death, took it from a tray in the dark, and drank it before the clock had finished its chime. It was, as you might say, the perfect crime." He paused, his eyes sweeping over them. "But the perfect crime exists only in the mind of the criminal. In reality, there is always the order and the method. To find the truth, one must not look at the murder itself, but at the theatre of the murder." Marcus Vane shifted uncomfortably. "We've heard all this, Poirot. You found the bottle in my shoe. Isn't that enough for you?" "It was enough to insult my intelligence, Monsieur Marcus," Poirot snapped, his eyes flashing. The bottle in the shoe was a clumsy addition to a beautiful equation. It was a shuffling of the deck by a player who feared I was winning the game. No, we must look at the darkness. In that darkness, 3 things happened. The lights failed, a sound was heard, and a glass was chosen. Poirot stepped toward the silver tray. The lights did not fail by accident. In the cellar, I found a carbon timer, a device that creates a short circuit after a precise interval of heat. It was set during the afternoon. The shuffling sound was not a person moving, it was the rotation of this very table, a piano wire, an iron weight, and a bored hole in the floorboards. The murderer did not need to be near the tray, they merely needed to be in the room to witness the success of their engine. "But the glass!" Cynthia cried, her voice trembling. "How could anyone?" "Know he would pick the poisoned one? Because the poisoned one was the only one he could pick," Poirot explained. "The red-stemmed Victorian glass. For weeks the murderer had encouraged Sir Alister's habit of using it. In the dark the hand seeks the familiar. But even so, the tray was turned. The murderer used a marker, a small piece of felt on the rug, to know exactly where Sir Alister would stand. By turning the tray a precise 90 degrees, the red glass was brought directly under his reaching hand. It was not a choice, mademoiselle, it was a mechanical certainty. A heavy silence followed. The logic was inescapable, a cold wind blowing through the room. "And the motive?" Dr. Arbuthnot asked, his voice steady. Alistair was a hard man, but who among us has the soul of an engineer to plan such a thing? "The soul of an engineer," Poirot repeated softly. "Yes, that is the key. We must look back 30 years, to a bridge in the Punjab that collapsed and took with it the honor of a man named Robert Sterling. He was the structural designer. He was disgraced by Alistair Vane's testimony and subsequently took his own life. He left behind a daughter, a girl who inherited his brilliance, his knowledge of mechanics, and a burning desire for the clarification of the past." Poirot turned slowly to face the semicircle. His gaze did not fall on the nervous Marcus or the weeping Cynthia. It fell on Eleanor Vane. "Madame," Poirot said, his voice dropping to a whisper, "you told us you lost your bearings in the dark. But a woman who grew up in the workshops of an engineer does not lose her bearings. She knows the tension of a wire. She knows the timing of a gear. You did not marry Sir Alistair for his wealth, though that was a pleasant bonus. You married him to become the ghost in his house. You were the one who polished the red glass. You were the one who applied the film of cyanide to its interior. And you were the one who, when Julian Thayer discovered your wire in the cellar, struck him down with the same cold efficiency you used to kill your husband." Eleanor Vane did not flinch. She did not cry out. She simply looked at Poirot with eyes that were as cold and clear as the winter sky outside. "A bridge for a life, Monsieur Poirot. My father was a genius. Alistair Vane was a thief who stole his designs and then blamed him for the flaws. I simply returned the weight to the proper side of the scale. The scale of justice is not yours to tilt, madame," Poirot said gravely. Suddenly, Eleanor's hand moved toward the small silk clutch on the table beside her. I started forward, but Poirot was faster. He caught her wrist with a strength that belied his age. "The second bottle, madame?" Poirot asked. "The one for yourself? No, that would be too easy. The little grey cells have already informed the village constable. He is, I believe, at the front door." As if on cue, the heavy oak doors groaned open. The wind howled into the hall, bringing with it a flurry of snow and the dark silhouettes of the law. The howling wind from the open door sent the candles flickering wildly, casting long, frantic shadows across the oak-panelled walls. Constable Miller, a stout man caked in snow, stood awkwardly as his men moved to secure the exits. Eleanor Vane stood at the centre of the hall, her wrist still held in Poirot's firm, gloved grip. She looked not like a captured criminal, but like a fallen queen, her silver dress shimmering like frost in the dying firelight. "You speak of scales and weights, Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice remarkably steady, "but you have only given this room a ghost story. Where is your proof? A wire in the cellar? A piece of felt? These are the tools of a house's upkeep, not the evidence of a murder." Poirot released her hand, bowing slightly. "The proof, madame, is not in the objects themselves, but in the way they were arranged. You see, everyone in this room had a reason to wish Sir Alistair dead. Monsieur Marcus needed money. Mademoiselle Cynthia needed freedom. Even Dr. Arbuthnot, perhaps, wished to end the suffering of an old friend. But only one person had the method." He turned to the rest of us, his eyes bright with the fire of his own logic. "Consider the shuffling sound. Monsieur Marcus heard it and thought someone was moving toward the tray, but remember the draught Mademoiselle Cynthia felt? That was not the wind from outside. It was the displacement of air caused by the rotation of the heavy circular center of the dining table. A mechanical movement, not a human one." "And the scent of the lilies? You mentioned them, mademoiselle, because their fragrance was suddenly shifted toward you as the table turned." Poirot walked to the silver tray, gesturing toward the empty space where the red-stemmed glass had once stood. The murderer knew that in total darkness, a man of Alistair's temperament would not wait. He would reach for the one thing he could identify by touch. "You, madame, were the one who suggested the New Year's toast become a tradition with that specific glass. You cultivated the habit, making his own hand the instrument of his execution." "But the bottle in Marcus's shoe," I interjected. "If she was so clever, why do that?" Because she is a perfectionist, Hastings, and perfectionists fear the unknown. When she saw me, Hercule Poirot, arrive at this house, she realized her perfect mechanical crime might be scrutinized. She needed a scapegoat. She took a spare bottle of the poison she had prepared and placed it in the most obvious place. But she made a grave error. The bottle in the shoe was clean, but the glass Sir Alister drank from was coated in a dried film of cyanide. A person acting in haste, like a desperate nephew, would have simply poured the liquid in. Only a chemist or an engineer's daughter would know how to prepare a timed-release coating that would only dissolve when the warm champagne hit the crystal. Eleanor gave a cold, dry laugh. "A theory, Poirot. Nothing more, is it?" Poirot reached into his pocket and produced the charred scrap of paper he had recovered from the safe. This was not a piece of the new will. I examined it closely by the light of my lamp. It is a fragment of a birth certificate from a parish in northern India. The name Sterling is visible. You were burning the evidence of your identity, madame. When Julian Thayer walked in on you, he did not know what it was, but he knew you were destroying something that belonged to his master. That is why you struck him." The constable stepped forward, but Poirot held up a hand. "One final thing. The how is mechanical, but the who is psychological. At dinner, Sir Alister was cruel to everyone. He mocked Marcus, he belittled Cynthia, and he ignored the doctor. But to you, madame, he was almost triumphant. He mentioned a clarification of his legacy. He had discovered who you were. He was not going to cut Marcus out of the will. He was going to expose you. He was playing a game of cat and mouse, not realizing that this mouse had built a better trap." Eleanor's composure finally fractured. Her eyes darted to the empty safe, then back to Poirot. "He killed my father," she hissed, the silver of her gown shaking. "He sat in his counting-house while my father's name was dragged through the mud for a bridge that Alistair Vane had sabotaged with cheap steel to line his own pockets. I didn't just want him dead. I wanted him to die by the very thing he loved most, his own impeccable, predictable greed." "And so," Poirot said sadly, "you became the very thing you hated, a person who values the machine more than the human life. You calculated the timing of the fuse, the rotation of the table, and the dissolving of the poison, but you failed to calculate the persistence of the truth." Eleanor Vane looked at the handcuffs in the constable's hand, and then at Poirot. With a sudden, fluid movement, she reached once more for the hidden pocket in her cloak, but the doctor and the constable were upon her before she could find what she was looking for. "Take her," Miller commanded. As they led her toward the door, she stopped and looked back at Poirot. "You are a very small man, Monsieur Poirot, but your grey cells, they are quite formidable." "They are all I have, madame," Poirot replied with a solemn bow, "and they are enough." The hall grew silent as the heavy doors closed behind them. Leaving us in the flickering warmth of the fire, the mystery of Blackwood Manor finally laid to bear. The morning of January 2nd arrived with a brilliance that seemed almost heartless. The clouds had vanished, leaving a sky of pale crystalline blue, and the sun turned the vast drifts of snow into a landscape of blinding diamonds. The vultures had dispersed. Marcus was in the library with the family solicitors. Cynthia was packing her trunks with a newfound quiet resolve, and Julian Thayer was being transported to the village infirmary for further observation. I stood with Poirot in the great entrance hall as the Daimler was brought round to the front. The house, once so heavy with the presence of Sir Alister and the shadow of his secrets, felt strangely hollow. The festive decorations, the holly, the ivy, and the great pine tree, now looked like the remnants of a play that had long since closed. "It is a strange thing, Poirot," I remarked, watching the servants begin the task of clearing away the debris of the past few days. Sir Alister spent his life building a fortress of wealth, only to be betrayed by the very order he cultivated. He was a man of habit, and his habits became his hangman. Poirot was meticulously brushing a speck of dust from his hat. He paused, his bird-like eyes fixed on the silver tray that still sat upon the sideboard, though the glasses had been removed as evidence. "Habit, Hastings, is a double-edged sword," Poirot said thoughtfully. "It provides the comfort of the known, but it also creates the tracks upon which the predator may run." Sir Alister lived by the clock and the ledger. He expected the world to move in straight lines and right angles. Eleanor Vane, or should I say Eleanor Sterling, understood this. She did not fight his nature, she simply used it as the fuel for her machine. I still find it hard to believe, I said, shaking my head. The mechanical ingenuity of it all, the wire, the weight, the timed short circuit. It was the work of a brilliant mind consumed by a singular purpose, Poirot agreed. When the heart is replaced by a gear, Hastings, the human being becomes a mechanism. She ceased to see Sir Alister as a man. He was merely the final calculation in a 30-year-old equation. She sought to avenge her father by becoming the very thing that had destroyed him, a force of cold, unyielding precision. He walked toward the door, his boots clicking with their usual rhythmic neatness on the stone floor. As we stepped out into the crisp, biting air, we found Marcus Vane waiting by the car. He looked older, the frantic jingling of coins in his pockets replaced by a somber stillness. "Monsieur Poirot," Marcus said, extending a hand, I don't quite know how to thank you. I know I wasn't the easiest guest, and I know what you must think of my debts and my character." Poirot took the hand with a grave smile. "The character, Monsieur Vane, is not a finished statue. It is a work in progress. You have been given a second chance, a gift from the new year. Sir Alister's legacy is now in your hands. I suggest you use it to build something more substantial than a pile of betting slips, a bridge perhaps that does not collapse under the weight of greed." Marcus nodded slowly. "I think I understand. The ghosts are laid to rest now. It's time to look forward." As the Daimler pulled away, winding its way down the cleared drive, I looked back at Blackwood Manor. It stood tall and dark against the white hills, a monument to a past that had finally been settled. "And what of you, Poirot?" I asked, settling back into the plush leather seat. "What does the new year hold for the greatest detective in the world?" Poirot leaned back, closing his eyes and basking in the warmth of the car's heater. A faint, enigmatic smile played across his lips. "For me, Hastings, I shall return to London. I shall ensure that my own small apartment is restored to its proper state of symmetry. I shall perhaps indulge in a very small glass of sirop de cassis to celebrate the triumph of the grey cells. And then I shall wait," he whispered. "For as long as there is human nature, Hastings, there will be disorder. And as long as there is disorder, there will be work for Hercule Poirot. The year is new, but the heart of man, that is as old as the hills. It is a puzzle that is never truly solved." He opened one eye and looked at me with a mischievous glint. "But for today, I think I shall simply focus on the lunch. I have heard there is a small inn in the next village that serves a most excellent omelette, provided, of course, that the chef understands that the eggs must be of an identical size." I laughed, the tension of the last 48 hours finally dissolving. "Some things, Poirot, will never change. Heaven forbid that they should, mon ami," he replied. "Heaven forbid that they should."